Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to the third meeting of the ADUs in Denver Advisory Committee. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Happy Cinco de Mayo, by the way. And thank you so much for those of you who have already done this. But if you haven't yet, and that might just be one or two of you, if you could go to the Zoom and rename yourselves so that after your name is your either organizational affiliation or neighborhood, whatever you think is useful for people to know. We're going to, I think, bypass introductions again, but just a reminder that you can find the list of names here on this slide of committee members. Welcome to members of the public. We may have folks trickling in. And I think before we get started with tonight's meeting and the agenda and what we're hoping to get out of it, we'll just do a quick little activity while we wait for last people to join. So I want everyone to think about an ADU that you like, that you love, that you imagine in your mind's eye, or just appreciate in some way. You can think of one that you wish you could design or live in, and pick one word that describes an attribute or a feature or a feeling about that ADU and put it in the chat. Just one word. You're welcome to say it out loud as well. Okay, I'm going to put okay, perfect. So I'm seeing a number of things, but charming, homey, cozy, simply, creative, fresh, simple, efficient, uniform, practical, modern, happy, relaxed. This is really actually great and super interesting. Joy. It's so interesting, the things that we all think of. So hopefully this helps us sort of transition into the space of this meeting, what we're doing tonight. Character. Thanks, Gabe. So basically the goal for tonight is as follows. And if anyone is missing the materials, the meeting packet from Josh, please put a note in the chat to Josh or to me, and we'll make sure you get the materials you need. But as you remember, in April, we heard from you all about concerns, barriers to building ADUs that were related to neighborhood impacts, cost, use, design. And so we had a lot of discussion about that. And tonight, we're just going to get a little more specific. We're going to drill down into some of those concerns and barriers in a couple of ways. One is we're going to use visuals so that those of you, some of you are extremely familiar with all of this, and it will be, that part may be repetitive, but for others of you, it's going to help, I think, to see visuals of what this actually looks like, how those concerns actually play out. And then second of all, how those concerns may play out in the different neighborhood contexts. So we're going to talk about the different neighborhood contexts in Denver and how under current rules, those ADU issues may have different implications and play out differently. So that's the idea for tonight's meeting. We're going to get more specific as a way of paving the way to start talking in June about possible tools and approaches and options for addressing the types of issues and concerns that you all have raised. So that's the idea for tonight. And just to give a snippet about the agenda and the format, so Josh is going to walk everyone through some visuals that depict different neighborhood contexts that the city bases its zoning on, and the types of ADU rules that apply based on those neighborhood contexts. So, the idea is just to cement your idea of what this looks like and make sure everyone's on the same page. Then we'll take some time for questions. We'll have a short break. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the meeting, at least an hour or so, going through an interactive exercise with some polling and discussion questions to get really specific about your concerns as they relate to those different neighborhood contexts and how they vary. So that's the gist. And then towards the end, we'll talk about public outreach opportunities, which has been a question that a number of people have had recently. We'll talk about focus groups and how to sign up. and the calendar, and then we'll have time for public comment. So that's the gist of how this is going to go. I will say a couple of just reminders about sort of discussion guidelines, and then see if anyone has any questions or any of the city folks want to add anything about the agenda. Please use the chat to flag quick questions you may have, but like last time, we're going to try to have the bulk of those questions come up in comments in discussion. So let's avoid doing long chats. And in general, we will be having periodic breaks between slides and things to ask people to see what questions people have. And then you all know how to use the hand raise function so that we can call on you when it's time. Again, since we're not doing introductions in general, please, the first time you speak, remind everyone who you are. That'll be helpful, I think. And just a reminder, there's materials on the ADUs in Denver website from past meetings. You have to go to the project archive to find the past meetings, but you'll find the committee charter and other materials there as well. For members of the public, there's a Q&A that's pretty active. Libby Kaiser has been amazing at responding to questions in real time, and then she will periodically kind of funnel some of those questions or comments into the main discussion. We also include all of those Q&As in the meeting summaries at the end, so you'll find them there. And just a reminder that there is public comment at the end. If you know you want to make a comment or raise your hand towards the end, please do so. And I think what we're going to do too is before we start, and Josh, I'll pass it to you. Maybe we agree that we would do introductions for any city council folks who are here, anyone who is a committee member who hasn't been at past meetings. Just a reminder that my name is Ryan Golton. I'm from the Consensus Building Institute. My colleague, Narissa Turner, is here as well to help us out. And let's see who of the city council members are here. I just am looking. City council folks, can you give a quick intros?
Sure, I'm Kendra Black. I represent District 4, and I'm happy to be a part of this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it looks like we may have Councilman Kevin Flynn attending as a member of the public, so he would be unable to introduce himself formally, but it's great to have you here. Okay, great. Anyone else, Josh, that we need to introduce tonight?
I think everyone introduced themselves in the previous two meetings, I believe.
Okay, fabulous. All right. Well, I think with that, first of all, does anyone have any big questions about the agenda or comments before we launch in? And I saw, Darcy, your note about not being able to find the packet, and I'm glad to resend it unless someone has already done that. Okay. All right. Well, Josh, I think I'm going to pass it to you. And just a reminder to everyone, please feel free to put questions as you hear from Josh in the chat, or hold them and we will open it up for questions at a couple of given times. And go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a bunch. Welcome back, everyone. We're actually going to start off, I think, briefly with a quick recap from our previous meeting given by Libby Kaiser from staff.
Thanks, Josh. So before we get into your super exciting graphic-oriented presentation, we wanted to take a few minutes to review the issues that we discussed at our last meeting, starting with the category related to impacts on the neighborhood. We heard some concern regarding the need to balance construction of ADUs with the preservation of open space in backyards. And to this end, we'll reconsider our regulations regarding maximum lot coverage. We also spent some time talking about parking, which currently isn't required for ADUs, and we acknowledge this is often a concern among neighbors where an ADU is proposed, but we generally agreed that adding a parking requirement would create an additional barrier to ADUs. We also acknowledge neighbors' privacy concerns, but seem to agree that protecting privacy shouldn't be a primary driver of this project. Nevertheless, there are regulations that impact privacy, such as the square footage of ADUs, whether they're located above garages and minimum setbacks, that also have design and cost implications, and which will be key to creating more context-sensitive ADUs with different designs for different neighborhoods. It was also mentioned at the last meeting that proactive outreach by property owners planning to build an ADU can help address some of these concerns. And when we discuss the design, construction, and buildability of ADUs, we acknowledge the minimum lot size requirements prevent the development of ADUs even when lots are zoned for them, and will consider whether this requirement should be eliminated. We also talked about how this project could encourage sustainability with conversions of garages into ADUs. And many committee members also cited the 1.5 story height limitation as a major barrier that wastes space and adds costs. And they press the need for more design flexibility, which we'll explore as this project progresses. Finally, the issue of privacy was raised again with respect to window design and placement, which is something that we'll keep in mind. And we can go to the next slide. So we had a couple more kind of buckets of issues, and related to cost and affordability, there's a lot of overlap with the previous issues. For example, current regulations encourage ADUs be located above garages, which increases their height and may seem out of context in some neighborhoods where single-story ADUs would be more appropriate and could be less costly to build. We also noted that the 1.5 story height limitation has cost implications as it can complicate design, whereas a 2-story ADU may be easier to build. A 2-story ADU could also create more livable space with economical square footage, which could accommodate a broader range of households. Committee members also noted that prefabricated ADUs or tiny homes would be more affordable if our zoning standards allowed for them. Finally, we discussed the high costs of foundation requirements, water and sewer tap fees, and sidewalk construction that could perhaps be offset by tax incentives for ADUs. While these issues in the black font can't necessarily be solved through zoning regulations, we appreciate that they still are major barriers to ADU construction. And lastly, related to uses and use allowances, we covered the issue of owner occupancy regulations that require property owners to reside in the primary house or the ADU if they're renting out the other. And we'll further explore that issue today. And while it seems that everyone agrees that property owners should be allowed to rent out their ADUs long-term, there are still some concerns regarding short-term rentals, which we'll also revisit near the end of today's meeting. At the last meeting, we also discussed allowing ADUs as accessory to other primary uses like townhomes and condos, whereas they're only allowed with single unit homes today. And it was mentioned that ADUs should be encouraged as a means to incentivize historic preservation. Finally, the issue of allowing commercial uses as accessory to a primary residential unit was raised, but it's unlikely to be addressed as part of this project, which is focused on accessory dwelling units. So now that we've summarized the issues we heard at the last meeting, we have about 5 minutes for discussion. If anyone has questions or comments or would like to raise an issue that maybe we haven't explored yet.
It looks like Rosemary, I see your hand up. Do you want to go ahead?
I'd like to make a comment regarding using ADUs to incentivize historic preservation. I'm wondering if we could consider allowing any landmark property to build an ADU, including in areas where they're not currently allowed. I think that would encourage owners who perhaps are thinking about designating their properties, but they haven't done so yet, or they're kind of on the fence. It's just a little perk for them that could be an advantage. So I'd like to suggest that as a serious consideration. Thanks.
Thank you. And just a reminder, we are not, we're not assuming these are consensus ideas by any stretch, but feel free to, if there's anything you didn't hear Libby say that you remember from the last meeting, or it seems like an omission or an extra idea. Gabe, go ahead.
Yeah, so wasn't there a topic that said something about using an ADU for an office space? And was that the same thing as the accessory for the commercial uses?
Libby, do you want to respond to that? Or Josh?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's what we're looking at when we say accessory to commercial uses. There are, certain allowances today, like you can do small home office and things like that. But I think the conversation kind of went a little further and talked about more commercial uses, like potentially allowing retail or sale of goods. And unfortunately, that feels a bit like a sort of a larger neighborhood-wide, more of a complete neighborhood discussion, which we do have some plan guidance in Blueprint Denver that talks about filling those small-scale commercial needs, but we do feel it might be a little bit out of the scope of this project at this time.
Thanks for that clarification. And Tara, I see your hand up too.
Yeah, just a comment on this cost and affordability list. I think it's worth detaching prefabricated ADUs from tiny houses. Those are really, in my mind, two separate issues, and prefabrication can be considered a way of lowering the cost of ADUs. And I think the point here is that could be made is that the complexity of the current regulations, especially the 1.5 story limitation, makes prefabrication, which is a really good option, really difficult. So that has nothing to do with tiny homes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, certainly. We'll keep that on the radar. Thanks for that feedback.
Okay, any others before we transition? We just wanted to make sure there weren't like giant holes that you remember talking about that weren't covered here. Yeah, Gosha.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to go back to the single story ADU versus above garages. I think what's important to note that right now the current regulation incentivizes garages by allowing the open space incentive if there is a garage. And I think kind of the caveat or the importance about this discussion is to allowing single story ADUs to take advantage of the same open space allowance or exemption. So kind of treating a single story ADU the same as we treat a garage, ADU of a garage.
Great. And that comment I think will come into even more focus today during the conversation. Thank you. Darcy, I see your hands up.
Yes, I wanted to say that even though we might be separating the prefabricated ADUs from tiny homes, I still would like to keep the tiny homes as a consideration for cost affordability.
Great. Thank you for the clarification. Josh, were you about to say something about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. That's good feedback. The tiny homes idea it's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, we'd love to see more opportunities for things like that, and especially affordability. But it comes down to building code issues in a lot of ways. You can essentially do a tiny home, but it must be tied to a foundation. It must be structurally up to code with any other structure. And so we really see a lot of that cost being dumped into the foundation, the infrastructure, which we sort of hinted at last meeting, that you could spend up to $40,000, $50,000 just preparing a slab to then build on, which could be a tiny home on top of that. But the idea of tiny homes is the idea that the entire structure, everything in it, costs $40,000. And so, yeah, we'd love to look and see where we can make changes within the building code, but it becomes more difficult than changing our zoning regulations.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Libby, for pulling up these slides, and thanks everyone for helping track the conversation, because a lot of what we're trying to do is have this be an iterative process where we build each meeting on the comments and discussion that came the month before. And if you haven't looked, these are all described in a lot more detail in the meeting summaries, which are on the website. So with that, I think Josh, and thank you, Libby, I think we're ready to transition to the next section.
Yeah, thanks for all the feedback, everyone. That's good stuff. So now we're just going to take a moment to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. I know last meeting we got fairly technical, fairly quick. So we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page and know exactly what we're talking about starting with this idea of neighborhood context. We're going to look closely at what that means for the city and what we can expect. And so we've been doing quite a bit of research on lots and development in the city, looking really closely at the single unit contexts. I mean, that's where we're hearing a lot of these concerns and where ADUs are starting to appear. So we're looking closely at those three contexts, the suburban, urban edge, and urban context that we define through the city. Roughly, it's split pretty equally. We magically landed on this number of about 30,000 parcels a piece. So there's 33,000 suburban parcels in the city, as well as similarly urban edge parcels and urban parcels. So we can think of these areas of each comprising a third of our single unit properties in the city. And currently, right now, we only have about 18,500 parcels that are actually zoned to allow ADUs. And we know that a lot of those have just come online in the past year or two through some of those legislative rezonings that we've talked about, like East Colfax, like Sloan Lake rezoning. So it's something around like 6,000 parcels have just come online in the past year or two. But we know we've only seen about 400 ADUs permitted since 2010. So that's giving us roughly a 2% utilization rate in those districts. So yeah, just looking a little bit more closely at the urban context. What do we mean when we say urban? We know that it's neighborhoods like Sunnyside, like Sloan Lake, South Park Hill, Wash Park, places like that. But the general character of these places are typically alley loaded. So there's typically an alley. There are sometimes driveways, but it's more rare. The block frontage usually has a detached sidewalk and a tree lawn. So the house feels a little bit further away from the street, potentially. The houses are mid to large and the lots are typically a bit smaller. The average lot size of those roughly 30,000 parcels is approximately 6,000 square feet, just under that. The urban edge context is comprised of neighborhoods like Northeast Park Hill, East Colfax, Westwood, Barnum West, Hilltop, places like that. It really is a mix between the two districts. It's pretty interesting. You get alleys in some places, not everywhere. Oftentimes you get a driveway, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have an alley and a driveway, which makes for an interesting condition for even more parking if need be. Typically the sidewalks are attached to the street, so like the Hollywood curb style, or often there's no sidewalk at all. The homes typically tend to be a bit smaller, but the lots are quite large. So the average lot size being just over 7,000 square feet. You can see in the image, there feels like there's a bit more room in the block for potentially ADUs. And finally, looking at the suburban context, these are places like Montbello, Green Valley Ranch, Marley, Harvey Park, Fort Logan, Hampton, Virginia Village, places like that. Here we don't find alleys at all. It's very rare. I think famously, Councilman Flynn has one alley in his entire district. So it does happen, but quite rare. Typically the lots are not very uniform. They're not always a perfect rectangle. You get a lot of angles. Similarly, the sidewalks are attached or don't exist. But typically the homes are a bit larger and the lots are quite large as well. So nearing 10,000 square foot average for this lot size in this district, this context rather. So looking at those lot sizes, it's interesting to see them side by side. Here we can really kind of compare the scale of what we're talking about when we say an urban lot. Now keep in mind, this is just the average urban lot. Obviously there's variation throughout, but this is the typical urban lot that you would see compared to an urban edge lot or a suburban lot. You can see that there's alleys at the rear of the urban and urban edge and not so at the suburban, typically with a smaller garage structure at the rear and existing parking structure. But just pausing here, thinking about these contexts, do we have any big questions about how the city establishes and distinguishes these contexts and what it means moving forward?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Or comments. Gosha, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if you have information about average age of structures in these different contexts.
We do, yeah, we can pull that data. We've got some really great maps and graphics. It's pretty concentric, as you would expect, moving from the city center outwards. But yeah, it'd be interesting to take a look at that.
I think that's important in a discussion about like the character and the historic preservation.
Certainly.
Thanks. Ozzy.
Yeah, Josh, I think this makes total sense. I just want to make sure we'll also address the issues that we see in the URH neighborhoods, which tend to have even smaller lots than the urban lots and extra challenges of their own that exist with the current code.
Yeah, certainly. We'll look at those higher intensity zone districts as well, but yeah.
Josh, do you want to explain a little bit, or Ozzy, the question just for people who may not be familiar with URH? Yeah,
certainly. I think, Ozzy's referring to a neighborhood like Baker, which, feels like potentially a single unit neighborhood, but it's actually zoned much higher intensity. It's zoned RH, which we know allows for row homes, duplexes, things like that. And those do, as we discussed previously, allow accessory dwelling units as well. And since Baker is, an older neighborhood, historically had a lot of single unit homes, there are lots of existing single unit structures that exist there, but they do have unique lot sizes, often like 25 feet wide, very small lot sizes. But yeah, we'll definitely keep those higher intensity districts in mind.
Great.
And just to highlight that, so we're going to focus a lot in this meeting on like the lower end of the scale in each one of these contexts, primarily single unit in urban edge and suburban. But, as you mentioned, Ozzy, like there's a whole range of zone districts within each context, and like Baker is zoned row house, and there's just, you won't see as many graphics that will remind you quite of Baker in this meeting, but we're going to kind of expand outward from there.
Thanks, Josh. That's helpful clarification. And Donna, I see your hand is up too. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not clear how adding an ADU to a potentially historic designation property, I'm not clear how that would work. Sorry, I missed that. Maybe if we discussed it last week or last time. It seems like we want to put money into the existing structure rather than, an additional ADU. I'm not sure. I thank you, Rosemary. I see your hand. I'm just curious. I don't understand how it works.
Well, I can give you an example. In my own neighborhood, we have a potentially historic, it's a historic house that is a potential landmark. So that particular house has a carriage house associated with it. And it would be nice to be able to tell those homeowners in our neighborhood, currently you are not allowed to build an ADU, but because you are designating your house, you get that advantage. You are able to use the carriage house as an ADU, assuming it fits in with the zone, all the restrictions on it, but also you're allowed to build one. Because if somebody is willing to designate their house as a historic structure, my feeling is they're giving a gift to the city, and the city should give something back to them because they're adding so much to our city for everybody and for future generations. It's really important. So any little incentives that we can find associated with this, I'd really like to pursue it.
I got you. Thank you. Thanks for that. That clears it up for me. And also, Josh, I appreciate the context of the current slide. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Great. And thanks for that question. I think we can get someone from Landmark staff to come speak to us about those possibilities at one of the upcoming meetings. About the designation status and that idea of incentivizing those structures.
Okay, perfect. All right. I am going to keep us moving along, Josh.
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks a bunch. Okay, so now we really want to look at what can be built in these districts. So we have a basic understanding of what we're talking about in these contexts. But now we really want to look at what could be built there. You know, we're constantly thinking of this future idea. Where are these places becoming and what should they become? So here is a brief description of the bulk plane. We sort of mentioned it last meeting. It's one of the regulatory tools that is essentially the tent that you can build within. If you were to apply this, you know, purple tent over your entire lot, you could essentially fill this entire lot in height or width. Granted that you meet the other requirements associated with it, but here's just a quick look at what that looks like in each context. So the urban house form, their bulk plane has, you know, more allowance in the front of the lot versus the rear. The lots are split into a 65-35%. Similarly, urban edge or uniquely, they have the ability to choose either using the suburban house or the urban house bulk plane in a lot of places, depending on your zoning, but generally that's the case. And then finally, the suburban house bulk plane, which does have a little bit higher of allowance. It's allowed to be deeper all the way to essentially the rear of the lot, to 20 feet from the rear of the lot, but it does start at a lower point on the side. So just visually getting an idea of what those look like and how those play out in different contexts. And this is just for the primary structure. So looking at other structures that are allowed in these contexts, the garage form building allowance is the same exact standard citywide. So everyone across the city is allowed to have up to a 1,000 square foot detached garage. And it follows a similar, it has its own bulk plane, but it's towards the rear of the lot. But here's just an idea of what that could look like on some of these properties, different sizes of lot square footages. Similarly, here's the ADU allowance for those lot sizes. So ADUs are regulated, limited in square footage by lot size. So it doesn't always break out in this case to where urban's only allowed a 650 square foot ADU, but the average urban lot size would allow up to 650 square feet. And so we get a little glimpse of what that would look like in each of these contexts. The urban edge lot size roughly would allow the 864 square foot allowance. And then the suburban, much larger lot could allow up to a 1,000 square foot ADU. So looking closely at just the urban context here, we want to really think about what could be built around it, you know, what else is in context and what the future condition could be. So thinking about that bulk plane, here's an example of 3 different lots side by side, where you see someone added the maximum garage to their lot size. The middle property here changed their primary structure. Not that someone would demolish one of those Denver squares, but you could in turn see some modern boxes that stacked up to something like this, 30-foot high structure as a primary. And then of course, looking at an ADU by comparison to that with its 24-foot height allowance, 1.5 stories. We do know that things like this are happening. You know, you would think, oh man, people aren't building houses that big, but surprisingly, I just biked past this one near Sloan Lake the other day, and I was like, that has to be a duplex, right? This is a single family house. And so don't be surprised when we see those things filling up the primary envelope. Here's an example in Urban Edge. You know, similarly, it's a garage, same exact allowance on the typical lot size, next to a newer structure that could replace that much smaller structure that was there. The primary is allowed to be 30 to 35 feet tall, depending on the lot size. This one's a 32-foot allowance. And then of course, looking once again at how an ADU compares to that with its similar allowances, 24 feet. We see this happening and playing out in Urban Edge as well. Here's an example of one of those modern boxes next to other Urban Edge lots. This primary structure is essentially filling up that entire bulk plane and maximizing their height potential. And finally, the suburban context. Similar tale here. The suburban actually allows some of the tallest buildings due to their lot size. You're allowed to go up to 35 feet in most locations, 2.5 story as a primary. You're still allowed to have a garage. Even if you have an existing garage, you're allowed to have multiple buildings on a parcel if it is a garage form. And finally, looking at what potentially an ADU could look like in comparison to that. We still have the same exact ADU standards citywide for now, the 24-foot tall, 1.5 story, with 5-foot rear and side setbacks. We're not seeing as many scrape and replaces in the suburban context just yet, but some of the newer builds are happening in closer neighborhoods. It's difficult to find a true McMansioned example, but generally the idea is that what comes and replaces the existing primary structure appears to be much, much bigger than what was already there. So looking at all of these things in relationship to one another, do we have some questions or discussion around what could potentially be built per neighborhood context?
Jennifer, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Thank you.
There you are.
You'd think after 2 years of using this, I could find the mute button pretty fast. I had a question about the thinking, why the garage size is uniform, but the ADU size is lot specific.
That's a great question. Do we have a zoning dinosaur here to answer that? Abe might be our closest bet, but I think it's just
I didn't call anyone a dinosaur.
Abe, have you ever been called a zoning dinosaur ever?
It's gonna be following me forever now because it's so true.
Abe, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the dinosaur perspective is that the garage rules are much older. The ADU rules were created when ADU allowances were added in the Denver zoning code update in 2010. There was a lot of neighborhood concern about accessory dwelling units. And so a lot of the current standards relate to compromises that were made during that discussion. And I think, there just really was concern about like, oh, maybe they'll just overwhelm smaller lots if they're not smaller too. And so you get this more nuanced set of rules for the ADUs, whereas the garage rules just carried forward from the dawn of time.
So just a quick follow on to that. So then theoretically, you might not be allowed to simply convert your garage to an ADU because it would be too big in some settings.
Very good thought, right. There's some rationale for thinking that the rules ought to be more aligned so that the use could move back and forth between the two more easily.
Okay, thank you.
Great questions. Gosha, go ahead and maybe you want to elaborate.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just gonna start with a technical comment because I think there's a mistake in the garage form. They also follow the bulk plane requirements. So you wouldn't actually see the gable wall facing the neighbor. The roof would be sloped away from the property line. That's correct, right?
Yeah, it does have its own bulk plane, but
yeah. So this is not exactly accurate representation, I guess. So there's not a benefit, I guess, for garages to not have to follow the bulk plane, similarly to ADUs. But also garages are governed by different setbacks. So in the many years that I have designed garages and ADUs, I have yet to see a garage that could be converted into an ADU for a variety of reasons. A lot of times, again, they are not required to have the setbacks that the habitable structure is required to have, and therefore they cannot be adopted. And there are also technical challenges related to building codes relative to bearing wall and foundation size and depth. So just from that perspective, I'm always hesitant to suggest that somebody can simply convert garage into an ADU because, again, I've not seen it be possible yet.
was up. I see a couple hands just went up. Darcy's hand went up. Was there somebody else? Yeah, go ahead, Darcy.
That was probably me. I reacted. I have in the Cole neighborhood several existing garages that have been converted into ADUs. Now, I don't know, Gosha, if you're saying that maybe they got a variance in order to do that. But there are several people that have approached me about the existing garages and placing the ADU or the livable space on top of their existing garages. And yes, they are not living or dealing with the setbacks because they were when you could push your property line or your building structure all the way to the edge of the alley. And I don't know if it's grandfathered in or how they're doing it. I'm thinking they have a structural engineer come out and make sure everything is stabilized to the point to where they are able to put something on top. And I don't know why, why these particular places are that way, but I'm just concerned about that because I would really like to know what the requirement is so that I can tell the person that's planning on doing that, you need to tear down your garage.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Darcy. And I can imagine this is a conversation, this particular one that we may want to continue later. Ozzy, I see your hand went up. Is it related to this conversation or is it something else? And if it is related, I think maybe we can be quick and then we could come back to this.
It is quick. I'd love Abe's suggestion of considering aligning the requirements between garages and ADUs. If I think back to when Peter Park was kind of selling Denver on the idea of our form-based zoning code, it was about, we actually care about the forms of the buildings in our neighborhood more than the uses. And if we have a form that works for one, then, maybe it's better for the zoning code to be less concerned with the use if they're both allowed uses.
Thanks, Ozzy. Well, I think that's good food for thought. And Josh, just in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest maybe we keep going, but we'll just bookmark that particular point.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for all the feedback. Now let's quickly build out an ADU. Let's see if I can build an ADU in 10 minutes here. Let's take a look at, here's one example of a parcel that you might commonly see in the city. Smaller lot size, just under the average. Let's call it an urban parcel in, say, City Park, Central City. It could be any lot size, it could be any structure. It doesn't matter what the structure is, since ADUs are regulated based on lot size. But just for an example, you do have to meet that minimum lot size requirement, as we discussed last time, as being one of those potential barriers. So 4,500 square feet for a B designated lot size would be required. This property would just make that basically 200 square feet greater. But if you look at something just a little bit smaller, a lot size that's maybe 2.5 feet shorter in width, they just don't get there. So suddenly that property is not granted a detached ADU. They could, of course, do an attached version, but we know that folks are really interested in this detached style. And so we want to look closely at aligning those standards a little bit more accurately or see what needs to change there. But let's go back to the original property and assume that we do meet that minimum lot size. So we are ADU eligible. We have the zoning and we're ready to actually fully build out an accessory dwelling unit on this property. Looking once again at that garage footprint, just comparison, what could be allowed there. You are allowed 1,000 square feet of garage. We know most folks aren't maximizing that out, but just for diagrammatic sake, we could take an example here. Here's one that does meet that accurate bulk plane description, I think that Goja was alluding to. So the roof would potentially be sloped side to side, lot size like this, if someone was to fully maximize their garage potential. But then let's compare that to what's allowed as an ADU. That's really what we're talking about here. The 650 square foot, the footprint allowance would have to be 5 feet setback from the side and the rear. So you end up with a basic location like this. You do have to contend with those lot coverage, the building coverage standards that we talked about last time. So in most zone districts, urban specifically, this one, you can only cover 37.5% of your lot with buildings. So if we were to maximize this footprint out, this coverage would actually equal closer to 44%. So we would have to go for that building coverage exemption, which says that you may exempt 50% of the square footage. You may exempt it from an ADU or a garage, but that ground floor must be made up of enclosed parking. In fact, we strictly state that it must be made up of 80% of the ground floor must be made up of parking. So that does leave you with, a couple of square feet, 130 square feet of usable space for your accessory dwelling unit, which could potentially become, a bit of storage, maybe a entry room, potentially your stairwell to access that living space above. One of the next rules we look at is that height allowance. So an ADU, as we mentioned, is allowed to be 24 feet tall. But we do know we have that bulk plane to contend with as well. So here's the basic shape of the bulk plane. This is the tent allowance for an ADU, similarly like we looked at for the primaries. And so the bulk plane says that anything that's outside of that bulk plane must be shaved down. It's not allowed to exist. So we have to kind of slice off some chunks of our building, which ends up with some sort of a form like this of an ADU. We know that, that technically that's not a very realistic roof line. So you basically fit in an actual roof underneath that. So you can see how the bulk plane kind of starts to shape a basic roof line and allow that sunlight to access the neighboring property, potentially to the north. We also have that 1.5 story limitation that says your upper story can only be 75% of the ground floor. So we know we started with that 650 square foot footprint, but now we need to shave away 25% of that upper floor. So we're left with something more like this. So everything that's visible here in the white is actual ADU space. Everything else is garage and or open space. So now looking at something more realistic, what would that livable square footage end up being? After you take away all the compounding sort of regulations that we have, you kind of whittled down to about 400 square feet of truly livable ADU space due to circulation, things like that, wall space, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but roughly this is what you'll end up with. And so we know that, on paper, you started with a 650 square foot ADU, but after you take away some of that ground floor portion, add the stairwell, you roughly leave about 120 square feet on the table and effectively preventing you from building out an extra bedroom in this accessory dwelling unit. So it becomes a question of how much livable space are we really providing for? It sounds like 650, but in reality, we're getting much, much less than that. And once again, it doesn't matter, exactly what the primary structure is. This ADU could be on multiple different lots with different character, but at this lot size, this scenario builds out to roughly a 530 square foot accessory dwelling unit. So we'd like to chat a little bit about that. We'd like to know, what do you guys think about the outcome? Folks that have experience building ADUs, is this a typical scenario that you've seen? And
Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just saw Sean's hand went up. I saw a note from Jennifer that this was really helpful. And before maybe we open it up for just comments and questions, I will say that we were hoping to start right around now with an hour of kind of interactive polling and discussion. So I might suggest that we try to keep this fairly limited and then have the discussion in the next section. But please, Sean, go ahead, and then Darcy.
Oh, I'm down to wait for the second section. I was just going to say that this 1.5 story limitation was a huge hindrance in my particular project, especially when we were trying to fit space in to make accommodations to make sure that the ADU was accessible. Like even in this this example, you show the stairway enclosed in the building. Doing that reduced the 75% that we were allowed to even build in more, but we needed the stairway to be enclosed for my mom to be able to get upstairs. So the 1.5 story limitation sort of voids the investment, but also voids the ADU itself a bit when you can't create a living space where people can comfortably live, especially when you're allowed to have the footprint, but then you just sort of have to make that 25% a roof as opposed to including it in the structure to accommodate making a really comfortable or just a comfortable living space. When you took down all the square footage and you're left with like 400 square feet under to live in, it kind of makes it, well, is it really worth it to put, like, who can we really accommodate in this space, especially as a long-term housing option? So I think addressing that is a huge thing. Although I don't know for sure, but I know that in our hearing, one of the suggestions was to come back and ask for a 2-story exemption. I'm not sure how true or valid that is. It did not work for us, even we wanted to come back to do that. So I think addressing the 1.5 story limitation is a huge thing to go through.
Thanks, Sean. And it's actually really helpful because some of those comments echoed what you said in the last meeting, but now with a lot more specificity with this visual to put into, to display what you were talking about. Thank you. And Darcy and then Naomi, let's go to you. And just a note that there's a lot of comments in the chat that these are extremely helpful visuals and will be helpful. Yeah, go ahead, Darcy.
Okay, my design is specifically very much like that. We had a lot of open area for kitchen, living room. We closed in the bedroom, made a bathroom. But when you really get right down to it, the sides of the wall where they come in, those areas were only about as tall as I am, and I'm 5'2".
Mm-hmm.
So you really can't get a full-size man to stand up around the edges. Now, it's perfect for a short person or someone who's small, but when you get a full-size man in there, it is the only place he can stand really upright is right down the middle of the area. So I really didn't like that. So I don't know where the 530 square feet came in, where you subtracted that from the 650. We were only able to put 487 square feet in there, and we lost so much space on the edges. So that even made it small.
Thank you, Darcy.
Good to know.
Yeah, it is. Naomi, go ahead.
Great. I'll make it super fast. I was speaking with a building reviewer on building permits about a constituent's project that looked a lot like this recently. And they pointed out a weird wonky thing too about having the stairway enclosed versus having a stairway unenclosed. For building code purposes, if the stairway is enclosed, that means there is habitable space and you're required to do radon mitigation on the ground floor, even though it is mostly just being used as a garage. So just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Knowing nods from city staff. Thanks, Naomi.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, I'm not seeing other hands up. And because of that, I'm sort of thinking that we'll carry on. One thing I would suggest, so we were going to take a 5-minute stretch break. I really would love to give you all time to have discussion during this next period. So is anyone like really needing a break? And if so, we'll still take it. And otherwise, maybe we'll just press on.
Feels like we're just getting started.
I know. Okay, how about this? We'll take kind of a natural break as we transition to this next this next section, because it requires getting some technology going. So Abe, do you want to go ahead and orient people to what we're going to do now?
Sure, we're going to get on Mentimeter again. So hopefully you all enjoyed it in our first meeting. And there are a couple of you that couldn't get on before, but we actually think probably the way that works the best is that if you have a smartphone, to get that out and go to whatever web browser you use on your smartphone, like Safari on an iPhone, and enter menti.com as the web address or search, and it'll ask you for a code. And I put the code just now in the chat. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 digits long. And then when you put that code in, you should get the little message you see on the right, which is that you're in the right place. You have the option also of just opening it in a web browser, and you can even do that by clicking on the link I put in the chat. I think if you have the phone, it's going to be a little easier because you can use your phone kind of like as a clicker or polling device, and then use your computer screen to see the images that we're going to look at and ask you questions about.
And otherwise, if you're on your computer, it's totally fine. It just means you'll have to kind of go back and forth between the Mentimeter and the Zoom. So that's fine as long as you're comfortable doing that. So if folks are having trouble, put a note in the chat. One of us can also give you a call. We have a couple of people who could probably give you a call separately and try to troubleshoot. But if you're having trouble, make a note in the chat.
We see lots of little hearts appearing in the poll, which is a good sign that people are getting online.
So click on the heart to show that you're there.
Yeah, we're 13 people, 14, 15. We're doing well.
Nice.
All right, we have 28 people who are on the who are committee members or city staff. So we should hopefully have closer to 20, 25, probably 25.
And the activity will just be open to committee members, but for members of the public, just if you see anything interesting or want to respond, we have a public comment at the end of the meeting, and we can definitely talk about it then. And then we also just posted a survey on the ADUs in Denver website that we'd love for you to take.
And Abe, while we have 30 seconds for people to get on, maybe I'm just going to share my screen to show the city's website and where to find the survey. Does that work?
Awesome. Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully you all can see my screen. It says ADUs in Denver.
Yep.
If you just even Google ADUs in Denver, you'll get here. But I'll put the link in the chat at the end of the meeting. See right here where it says take the survey. So for those of you who are members of the public joining tonight, you can take the survey there. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. How are we looking, Abe?
We're looking good. You should now be seeing the same thing on your computer screen as you're seeing on your phone.
Looks good.
If you used your phone to get in. Awesome. And we're up to 21 folks.
Perfect.
22, we're so close. We had 23 people, right, Ryan?
Well, we have city staff. We have 28 with city staff and facilitators, but I think that's about 22 committee members. So I think that might be good.
Yeah, I think that's everyone.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's move forward then. So we're going to start with a very silly question that's more a test of whether you're awake or whether your device works. But which of these ADUs do you think fits best? Hint, I would probably choose the fourth answer, and that's what most of you are doing. Because this is kind of a trick question to tee up what we're going to do next, which is look at a lot of accessory dwelling units like in different contexts where you can see the neighborhood a little more.
You can't fool this committee.
Nope. We'll have to try harder next time. Okay, I'll move on. Looks like most of you answered that you can't tell without seeing the surrounding context. So let's start looking at some context. we're going to actually just use some samples from different neighborhood contexts across the city. For now, like for this meeting, we'll just do like one sample neighborhood from the urban context, one from the urban edge neighborhood context, and one from the suburban context that Josh described. And definitely want to recognize that there's a really wide variety of things that happen within each given context, as kind of Ozzy was bringing up. You know, there are neighborhoods that are in the urban neighborhood context. For example, the Harkness Heights neighborhood that just are mostly like 1 or 1.5 story bungalows, much lower scale than this. Then there are neighborhoods that actually are zoned to allow for a variety of things, row houses and apartment buildings even, that look really different than this. But just starting with you know, a single unit area that allows ADUs in urban neighborhood context, think Sunnyside neighborhood, think Platt Park. Here's a sample that might hopefully look a little familiar to you if you live in a neighborhood like that. And then just to bring the point up again that, you know, even though there's a certain kind of built condition in the neighborhood now, the zoning has an allowance for other things to happen with the primary structure, with ADUs. So this is like that bulk plane or that 3-dimensional building area in which you could build new structures within this particular sample block. So for example, moving to the next image, we just added some contemporary infill then in the foreground that those new structures fit within that 3-dimensional area, and therefore they were allowed to be built by zoning as new primary structures. And you know, some of you live in neighborhoods that are changing in these ways, and some neighborhoods are just starting to change. So moving on from there, let's look at accessory dwelling units. So this is they're kind of this yellowish tan color, and these are accessory dwelling units that would be allowed to be built in a neighborhood like this, where the zoning actually allows ADUs now, like in Sunnyside, for example. And this is a lot of detached ADUs. You know, basically based on the rate of new ADUs that we're getting in the city, it would be, it'd be more than a dinosaur. It'd be a buried dinosaur before there were really many or any blocks in Denver that had this many accessory dwelling units. But for our purposes, it gives us a little bit of a variety of things to look at. And so we first want to ask you a question. I'm going to make sure this appears correctly on my phone. Yeah, it looks good. That's very general, and you can really you just be reacting to what you see here. But is how well do these currently allowed ADUs fit into this sample? So just based on what you can see, you don't know how big they are, or whether grandma's living in there, or whether it's renters, but just react to this.
And keep in mind that we're then going to discuss, we're going to look at how people responded and then discuss. So if you have points you want to make about why it's hard to answer or how you answered, we will definitely cover that.
Good point, Ryan. And I forgot to mention that we're not thinking about this as being voting for anything. It's really just a conversation starter. And the conversation is probably more important to us for next steps, honestly, than literally where you place your slider on this question. So I'll toggle back and forth a little bit so we can see how the results are looking. Mostly people say, yes, they fit. And what I'll try to do, at least until we hopefully start to catch up on time a little bit, is run through a few questions and then stop for discussion, and we can go back to individual slides if you want to.
Yeah.
So move on in 1 second here. Okay. Before I move on, let's just check in. Yeah, we're at mostly they fit, according to you. And you can see a little barely visible hump over on the left-hand side that at least one person said, no, they do not fit. I think that's what that means. Okay, let's look at a different angle, and we'll ask about the placement of these are the same accessory dwelling units in that same block, and ask about whether how they're placed in relation to neighbors is roughly compatible, fits in, or if they're too close to neighbors, or they cover too much lot area. So those are the questions on this one overall.
And to clarify, Abe, that's an alley running through
That's an alley, right?
the back
And
ends of these lots.
in the urban
Yeah.
neighborhood context, almost all blocks have alleys, although you will get some lots that don't have access to the alley. But in this particular case, they all have access to the alley as well here. All right. Let's check in on how things are coming together. Placed about right. Okay.
And while people are taking this, Abe, I'll just say that Renee had to join late. So she just joined. She's got the link and she's going to be taking it as well. So you'll see.
Oh, perfect.
go on
Hey,
pop
Renee.
up.
Welcome.
Hey, Renee.
And anyone else, if you still haven't been able to get on or anything like that, definitely raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'll give Renee just a moment to answer this. Let's see. Renee, the accessory dwelling units, I'm sure you can figure it out, are the kind of yellowy tan things. Okay, I'll go ahead and move onward. Before doing so, just want to, I think we just got Renee's in. So pretty strong agreement that the ADUs are placed fairly well in relation to neighbors. They're not too close to neighbors, and they don't cover too much lot area in this particular case. Okay.
Yeah, looks good. About 80% agreement.
Yeah. And before we move on, I just want to go back to the previous slide and just write this number down, because I was going to compare it to some future answers that you guys will give us. Okay, we just have a couple more quick views and then we'll have some discussion. All right, so based on this view, does this ADU fit in? This is a bit of a where's Waldo or where's ADU? Can you guys see it hiding back there behind the middle house? We'll see another view of this in a minute, but just can answer based on this view, that'd be great. And if you're not seeing this question like on your phone, if you're using your phone, you can click on the little button that says like go to the current slide, should be near the top. It'll go to this. Okay, some pretty strong agreement that things are working in terms of this ADU fitting in.
What ADU?
Yeah, we fooled Josh.
Okay, I see it.
Okay,
Good
so let's go on to another view. This actually is the same ADU. Where now you get a much better view of it from above, as if we were a bird. And we're just going to ask you the same questions just to see if the answers vary.
Ozzy posted a note wishing for an okay, but it could be better button, which I think is a great point.
Okay,
You're probably
great.
not alone and a fair point for discussion, I think.
Yeah, and if you can break that down into location, size, and height, I don't know, like, okay, but it could be better is maybe somewhere in the middle. I don't know. Okay, so we've got 19 folks on that. Let's just compare really quick. Like this one, folks mostly agree that it fits in, especially about the location. The size kind of gets the lowest score. And then here we had very high scores in all the categories. So that's on the same ADU. So it kind of depends on your perspective, obviously, how well this ADU fits in. So just want to, before we move on to the next context, open it up to the all-important discussion about why you said what you said on each of those poll questions. So anyone want to raise their hands or just jump in?
I see Jennifer's, and Donna, I think it might be useful to hear from you on your comment about the window placement. But Jennifer, go ahead.
Just a quick note. I'm thinking I live in the urban context, but my neighborhood, it's all mostly around me is single story houses. And I think I would answer the question differently if that front on view is looking at a single story house. So given what we looked at, I said, yep, it looks fine. I'm not sure I'd answer the same way if it was a different building form in the urban context.
Yeah.
Right. So we need to see some different sub areas, and you'll get a chance when we look at the other context to see some ADUs mixed in with much lower scale existing construction.
Thank you. Donna, go ahead.
I agree with Jennifer. Back to the windows. I liked that the windows were not pointing towards the next door neighbors. They look to be pointing towards the alleyway. That given the height, it didn't seem too high, but it could be a problem for a neighbor when we were talking about privacy last meeting. So anyhow, so I like that. I think that looks really good. And then I agree with Jennifer about, it looks good in this kind of, in these photos, not photos, but illustrations. It would be really helpful to see it in like real life. I just am looking around my neighborhood and it seems like our homes are much closer. So in the context of the illustration, yeah, I think it fits, it looks good. If they were closer together, or maybe it's just that the illustration looks further apart, but they actually are closer together. Does that make sense? In real life.
Yeah. Thank you.
And then, one other thing, sorry. This is from the perspective that before what you said, you showed the shading where we could fill in the whole block, kind of the whole umbrella. And this is keeping that in mind, correct? Like this thing could be much larger, actually. Is that what you were saying before?
The primary structure could be quite a bit larger.
Primary. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we really want to keep that in mind. I mean, I know we associate with what we can see and what we live by, but the idea is that that future condition can change, and ideally, something much bigger could be put in its place, right?
Cesar, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that, I mean, these things aren't designed. So, I mean, I'm just really just basing it off kind of this, the typology piece here. But my first reaction is like, oh, somebody lives there, as opposed to like looking at the other ones like, oh, that's a garage, that's a shed. But so that immediately to me is like, for the person that's going to live there, like, and it feels like somebody should be there and living there. I mean, I might be sounding a little corny here, but I mean, you're immediately kind of providing some form of dignity and acceptance for the people that are going to live there. And that's what I'm looking at. That's what I want to make sure that, you know, we don't forget, you know, at the end of the day that, you know, it's not some second class citizen. It's just unless it's somebody else that's here. So it's in making it feel like it is a home. And so like in my reaction, that's from this specific view is like, also like, we're never going to experience it like this. We're going to experience it walking down the alley. And if it feels like I'm walking in front of somebody's house instead of somebody's, you know, garage, like there's an immediate sense of safety, even if it's just perceived. And looking at this view from the front, it's like, I don't see how it's in any of this experience from the street has really been altered. In fact, I felt that the alley experience has been lifted. And that's what, you know, and that's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm looking at. So I know we've been talking a lot about, I guess, the typology piece, but I guess I'm coming at it at least from, I guess, the more human side, just because I feel like we haven't really talked about it so much.
Thank you so much, because you're right. I think, you know, there was at the point that was made at the last meeting, and a lot of you echoed that we should be talking about humans, not right cars as dictating rules, but you're really making that real and palpable. So I'm so glad you raised it. Were you going to say something else, Cesar? Did I interrupt you? And there's like
no, I mean, that was just the
Okay.
big one. It's like, and that's really what I'm you know, that I'm able to see, and why I lean towards the right there on the 10s on them for the most part, just because it felt like the beginning of, you know, of this secondary street or just no walkable space on over there. It felt more like the beginning of a community.
Awesome. So many people are agreeing with you. Thanks for raising that. Rosemary, and then Ozzy, and then we'll move on with our next set, because I think we have 3 sets of these and we want to make sure we get to all of them, but go ahead. Sorry, Rosemary.
Okay, I'll make this quick. I think it would be really helpful if we had diagrams from the ground level. For example, somebody standing in the yard next door. To the perspective on this, I'm confused because from the front, it looks much lower than the house. The bird's eye view, it looks, the height almost looks as tall as a house. So it's really difficult to get a sense of what it actually feels like unless you're standing on the ground next to it.
So maybe for future meetings, we'll see if we can have more of those perspectives. Thank you. That's useful.
Definitely.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Josh. Did you want to say something about that?
No, we agree. Yeah, I think we've got some of those images later on in other contexts.
Perfect. Okay, go ahead, Ozzy.
Yeah. I don't want to take too long, but I'm worried that the survey results we gave you just now could be misread as saying that the existing zoning for ADUs in these neighborhoods is perfect. And it's not for a lot of reasons we've already discussed. I think you're trying to get more of a grip on just how are people feeling about ADUs in these neighborhoods. But if we go back to that one that had the aerial of the ADU in the middle, like as more ADUs get built, our existing zoning is forcing them all to look pretty much like the one that's in the center of the screen there. And so if you imagine that built again on every neighboring parcel, as more ADUs are built, we get sameness in the alley, even though we get this wonderful variation and variety at the front. And so we need to fix that as part of this process, I think.
Awesome, thank you.
Good point, Ozzy. And yeah, Gosha was agreeing with you about the concern on misreading what you're saying about these models. And so just want to let you know that we definitely agree that we need to combine what you're saying about how well the things that can be built now fit in or don't fit in various ways with all of the other feedback that Libby was talking about earlier in terms of removing barriers and all of that. So just kind of merge the two major tracks of this discussion, which are the remove barriers, but also just to make sure that while we're moving them, we still have the right standards to get them to fit in relatively to different contexts.
Yeah, thank you, Ozzy. I'm sure you are not alone in that. And I think it's an important point to emphasize. And maybe at the end of this meeting, the city staff can sort of reflect back again their takeaways to make sure that they're consistent with what you all are thinking as well. Donna, do you have your hand up again, or is it up from before? It's up from before. Okay. Just checking. I can lower it. All right. Abe, go ahead, or yeah.
Let's move forward. So, this always happens, that it's so hard to kind of deal with like the street level human views versus, views from the sky versus views from birds. And so you'll probably be a little frustrated that there's just a little too much view from above, but it also does give you kind of the broadest picture of what's happening with the different buildings. And so you might have to imagine the different perspectives a little bit. And then in the future, we can try to show more things that are from the human perspective of the immediate neighbors or somebody walking down the sidewalk or down the alley. So here's a sample of the urban edge neighborhood context. So for example, this could be a part of East Colfax or maybe Montclair. It's not, so we're in a different zoning context, but this will at least get us kind of a different scale of built form, which should, maybe we'll see how the reactions are different. And so you can see, like in this context, basically the zoning rules are very similar to what they are in the urban context, but there's a much bigger difference between what actually is built, like the traditional neighborhood, and what you could build in the future in these three-dimensional spaces. So jumping onward from there, well, there's an example. We built that same contemporary infill in this neighborhood, and it probably looks a little more out of place. And this one should have just been infill without the ADUs, but so let's go on to the next one, which is, all right.
Abe, can you explain infill for people that might not know what that is?
Sure. So infill, we're just basically referring to any new construction on an existing lot. So in the case of this contemporary structure that you kind of see in the foreground here, that happened because the owner tore down the house that was there and built a new house according to that zoning allowance that we saw kind of three-dimensionally. And now we've built, again, quite a high number of ADUs for any one neighborhood. But let's see what your thoughts are about how these currently allowed ADUs fit into the sample block we have here. You guys are getting good at this.
And just to verify, it looks like there's an alley there, Abe, but I can't really tell.
There is an alley present there.
There is an alley. Yeah. So it's interesting that we were talking about the building age, the average building age within the different neighborhood contexts. Like I used to do consulting work in residential zoning in a lot of different cities, and you actually just see the same patterns everywhere, like especially in Western cities, that there are sort of core neighborhoods that have those urban characteristics with rectilinear blocks and alleys and detached sidewalks. And then you get this kind of urban edge condition where, like here, you've got a sidewalk that's not detached, like there's no lawn between the sidewalk and the street. There is an alley, but a lot of the parking access, or some of it at least, is from the street. And sometimes it even goes all the way back to a structure that's on the alley. And then kind of at the later edge of development, then the alleys just disappear entirely and all the vehicular access is from the street. Okay, we've got 19 folks. Let's see where we are. So, oh, I just realized you could do this. Like you can see that one person said was more on the no, they don't fit. So maybe when we get to the discussion, if you'd be willing to say why, that would be a good perspective. But mostly folks said that the ADUs in general did fit. And this just may be because people are thinking about things differently based on the discussion, but that's actually kind of a higher compatibility ranking than the ones in the urban context got. Let's move on to the next question though. All right, we're going to look at it from above and ask those same questions that we asked from above in the urban context. Are these ADUs placed about right in relation to their neighbors, or are they too close to neighbors? Do they cover too much lot area?
And Abe, especially as people are getting more comfortable with the polling, you might want to pick up the pace a little just to make sure we get to all of these and the discussion.
Yeah, I think we're about up to 10 minutes behind. So yeah, pick up the pace a little.
Yeah, I think the discussion around suburban is going to be
we need time for suburban. Okay, got about 15 folks, and it's looking like placed about right. They're not too close to neighbors. They don't cover too much lot area. Not 100% agreement about any of these things, though.
90% about right, though. That's higher than we saw in urban. So it feels like a little bit more space between lots, between primary structures, maybe makes you feel a little bit more comfortable about adding another unit onto those properties.
Interesting thought. Yeah, because I would have expected people to say that they fit in more in the urban context, but that doesn't seem to be true. All right, I'm going to move to the next slide so that we can start to get an actual human level perspective again. And I don't know who these weirdos are hanging out on the sidewalk, but just interested in knowing how well the ADU that you can see over on the left there fits in terms of location, size, and height, just based on what you can see.
Yeah, so here's an attempt at more of that eye level view, what you might see from your car or walking on the other sidewalk.
And because that ADU is on a corner lot, it actually kind of faces the side street. Okay, we've got 18 responses. So location, good. Size, slightly less good. Height, even less good. And so maybe that has to do with the fact that the primary structure is quite small and is not very tall. And Naomi is talking about the roof form. Yeah, that this maybe is the first one we've seen that has a flat roof. Okay, so here, this we'll see if this works. You should be able to actually take that little dot that appears and just move it over. And I'm trying to do it on my phone. It's really small. But if there's some aspect of one of these two ADUs that you see here that you think is something about its design that helps it fit in, just stick your dot on that, just as a kind of pin for the discussion that we'll have in just a sec.
I'm so interested in what the discussion is going to be and what people are going to say. This is really interesting.
Got Well, lots more people want to talk about the little ADU. Okay. I'm going to move on, but if you didn't place your dot, feel free to, actually, since we're just going to discussion, I'll just move back to this slide in case you hadn't gotten to place your dot yet. And maybe just ask on this one for someone who placed a dot on the larger ADU, the one on the right with the flat roofs, which we saw in the previous question too, what you wanted to highlight that helped it fit in.
Jennifer, go ahead. And we've also got an interesting point in the chat, but go ahead first.
Specifically, I just wanted to point out that those second story windows, the fact that they are looking out to a street in this form is nice. It helps. As opposed to looking into someone's backyard like the two-story house does. I have that exact situation next door to me right now, where it's not an ADU looking over my backyard, it's the form-based code conforming giant new house that went in.
Well, and I'm seeing a couple points in the chat. One is the garage door should face the alley, not the street.
Gosh, just being a good urban planner. Yeah.
Yeah. And Councilwoman Black said, I like them both since they have front doors on the street. We also had a comment about this image bringing home how different corner lot ADUs are from mid-block ADUs. So does anyone want to say more about any of that in the chat or just another comment? And I think, Gabe, you were probably going to go to the smaller house, the smaller ADU.
Yeah, but also just on the corner lot thing, would anyone want to just hazard a comment on whether the rules should actually be different on corner lots? More flexible, I presume, but I don't know.
I'm seeing a nodding head. Go ahead, Sean.
My house is a corner lot house. And one of the things that we thought we should have an exception with was the 5-foot setback, because the way that the zoning code was, is it was requiring us to move our garage or the ADU future structure closer to our neighbor, as opposed to keeping it closer to the street. We garden, we have our chicken coop in the area that it wanted us to move it into, but and it was also gonna infringe more on our neighbor and now be a 2-story structure. So I thought the corner lot should maybe have different exceptions, because some of the rules that are in place are very much so for the houses in the middle of the neighborhood. So I thought that there should be some sort of consideration for corner lots for sure, especially for us to move our structure to keep it looking very neighborly. That was one of the things that I liked about the one level house in the image that we're looking at, is that it just looks like another home in the neighborhood. It doesn't seem like something extraordinary.
Thanks, Sean. There's a number of comments also in the chat about corner lots, including that corner lots should allow tandem homes. Let's see, someone's has some background noise. I want to go to Darcy. And then, yeah, Sean, there's some thumbs up for your comments. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Darcy.
The ADU that I designed was on a corner lot, and we had some issues with the power pole in the alley to where we had to move the doors to the north side of the design, north side of the building we were developing, because the city wouldn't allow us any curb cuts in our neighborhood. And that, I saw that in the chat where there's those curb cuts. So that specific dot where that I guess driveway is, we weren't allowed to do that. And I think that corner lots should be allowed to have that accessibility to the street, that versatility on what you can design. So they actually do have a garage, but they can't even pull into the garage and use it as a garage at this point.
Yeah, it's a good point, Darcy, that we probably should have showed these with access from the alley, because unless there already was street access there to a garage, we're generally not allowing the new curb cuts now.
Yeah, there was also just a comment from Renee that corner lots, corner ADUs should have front doors and not driveways, and should be allowed to be separate ownership, i.e. tandem homes. Let's see, Brooke, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my dot was actually like right on the driveway. And the reason why I mean, and it applies to both of them, but the fact that both buildings are able to address the street allows more of like the street to be activated and engaged from a pedestrian level. And so in these images, that's what I really appreciated about the corner lot.
So we should probably move on. We didn't get to talk about the small one too much, but folks noted that, you know, it fits in pretty well because it just looks like a house in the neighborhood. A lot of dots on the porch, which isn't too surprising. So let's look at Suburban, our last context. And there's a lot of variety in this neighborhood context. Here's kind of one version of it. Maybe it looks a little bit like some parts of Montbello, maybe Wilshire. You know, we got, it's fairly low scale, but it's not the lowest scale that you see in the suburban neighborhood context. Here's those zoning allowances. And as Josh explained earlier, we don't have like the two-part thing going on here with the bulk plane in the suburban neighborhood context. Like, you don't have to make a smaller house on the back of the lot. It just goes across the lot. And so the contemporary infill in the back there got added within that zoning allowance. And then we'll put some ADUs in. And I will note that right now, we really have only one zone district in the suburban neighborhood context that allows ADUs. And it's a very specialized zone district that really was written for one part of the city back in 2010. And it has a really deep minimum lot depth of 150 feet, which is not true for the detached ADU rules anywhere else in the city. And so when we've been getting rezoning requests in the suburban neighborhood context, folks are actually requesting like these waivers, like to customize the zoning to not have that 150 foot minimum lot depth. And some of those have been approved by city council. More recently, we had one denied, and a lot of the reason given was that we actually just need to get through this process and figure out what the rules really should be in this kind of context before we consider individual rezonings. So we're just assuming here that these ADUs were built under like that there was a waiver of that minimum lot depth as people have been requesting, because these lots aren't that deep. And all right, well, we're just going to be asking the same first two questions. Yeah, I'll try to give you a better view there about how well the ADUs that you can see, there's kind of one on the right hand side that you really can't see, fit in.
Yeah, so no alleys here. You can see kind of more shallow backyards.
So in this case, the fact that that ADU has the garage access to the street, that type of setup typically would be allowed because there was no other option. However, it probably would only be allowed in cases where there wasn't already some access that could have been used on the lot, which would be true of that particular lot. So we're up to 17. That's pretty good. Sorry, let me just look at what the results are looking like. All right. generally folks think they fit in slightly lower than the last context. Not much different though. Sorry, I accidentally hit the wrong button. Stand by. Can everybody still see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, 8.2 for now.
8.2, yeah. All right. So let's move on to looking from a blimp. And Councilwoman Black was saying on the previous slide, I think, previous view, that the scale looked okay, but being like 5 feet from the neighbor's fence is what people are really concerned about. So that accessory dwelling unit that was in the foreground in the previous view is the one that's kind of on the lower left in this view.
Right, yeah, that 5-foot rear setback is something we'll look closely at. Compared to, yeah, what could be built as a primary, which would be a 20-foot setback at the rear.
Okay. All right, so generally speaking, it looks like those of you that remember what we saw in the previous versions of this question, I think we're getting a little more, less agreement that they have the right relation to their neighbors and that they might maybe too close to the neighbors, at least in some cases, but not that they cover too much lot area. So it's more about the relationship to neighbors than exactly how much lot area they have, or maybe even how big they are. Okay, we got 19 folks. So let's do the street views. Okay. You can use your little dots on this one, I think, just to get the discussion going. Which of these two do you think fits in best?
This will make for good discussion because they're sort of evenly split. Abe, we are seeing your tallying slide.
Oh, all right. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, and there's some interesting comments in the chat that can sort of seed our discussion when you're ready, Abe.
Okay. I'll move to the next slide. Okay. Based on this view, does this ADU fit in 3 different categories: location, size, and height? Give you a better view of it there.
Yeah, another corner lot condition.
Corner lot, no curb cut. Height's doing good. Some folks are not sure about the location. Okay, we're up to 19 folks. And this will be our last question here. So Ryan, did you see anything interesting in the chat you want to bring up?
Well, yeah, I think there's something about the proximity to other units that are that may be causing concern. And Sean mentioned if he lived in the left bottom corner house in one of the earlier slides, he'd feel pretty closed in. So I think it's the proximity to other units, including the primary.
Okay.
I mean, I made that comment. I can add on. I think that, or I can do it later too. If we're not there yet.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it, Renee.
I think one of the things that is the close proximity to another primary house, the code really just talks about the setback from your own primary home. But I think in this situation, what I'm hearing is comments about the proximity to another primary home. And then I would say another issue that could help with that is the historic district has something that says, like, you know, any additions have to be smaller than the primary unit. They can't be taller. And so that could help from a context standpoint that would limit the height of an ADU so it didn't tower over right next to a primary unit that was one story.
Yeah, good thoughts. And just to point out, in this example, some of these units are actually attached versions as well. So there is some of that going on, which we might be reacting to.
I was also just thinking that in that suburban setting, a part of moving out there in my own mind is the space that you have from your neighbors. And when we add in ADUs and we add in the density in the suburban setting, you're to have 2 additional units, which is like 2 additional families. I don't know how many people would be housed there, but that seems like a lot of people. And then the 2 additional houses are now in my open space in my backyard on that corner lot. You can't control what your neighbors build, but just under those circumstances, I would feel pretty closed in, like there was no real private space, and it was coming from both sides of my lot. So that just seemed, I don't know, that made them seem more intrusive just for that particular lot.
Yeah. I see Naomi's hand is raised, and I know that we're running short on time here, so we want to hear from anyone who wants to speak. So go ahead, Naomi.
Thanks. Just that one first illustration. I don't know anything about this, and I don't think we have trees and like buffering makes a huge difference. And I know that's like very much site design, and it's not so much zoning stuff, but it just, you know, the side image of the much taller ADU that maybe is a little out of scale. We'd think there's not really any 2-story buildings around, but there's a mature tree next to it to be made. Yeah, right there. It's like, oh, that does make a big difference. And I know we probably can't talk about that kind of thing, but I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Thank you. Do others want to? Yeah, it looks like a couple others. Darcy, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
My comment is regarding the number 1 on one of the previous slides that we had earlier, where you had the corner lot with this great big old giant building on it, and then a little tiny building in the front. Somehow or another, even though you are zoned to have more space, it seems as though you should be able to make it site specific. That if your house is only a single-story house, then you can only build a single-story or a small ADU instead of the great big old giant ADU. And I think Abe had wanted me to comment on why I said it didn't fit. But that was a way back. This one here, on this tiny one in the front, and then that great big old giant one, it looks like 2 separate independent primary homes instead of an accessory dwelling unit.
Right.
Anyone else want to just comment on that idea that you might actually relate the permitted size of an accessory dwelling unit to the size of the primary structure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a question of would it be imposing a barrier to the ADU or not?
I wonder if we'd see people building tall additions on their houses so they could get taller ADUs.
Well, at least it would match.
Dosha, go ahead, and then Renee.
Yeah, I think in terms of affordability and equity, I think relating the size is not the right approach because somebody with a smaller house may build an ADU for a family member. And I don't know that their small house should limit their ability to have another dwelling unit on their lot and the size of it. Kind of requiring the main structure to be large in order to accessory structure to house a family doesn't seem like equitable approach.
Thank you. Renee, and then Sean.
I would agree with what Gosha just said. I think if anything, the size of the ADU should relate to the size of the lot and not necessarily the size of the other unit, because that's an equity issue. And then just, you know, in this image that you're showing right there, one of the reasons that ADU seems like it doesn't work is because it doesn't work within the setbacks that are the pattern on that street. So it's in front of that both primary structures, even if it's on a side street. And so I think those rules are what help keep things within the pattern, the urban pattern of a block.
Yeah, good point.
I see Sean's hand up. I see an interesting note in the chat from Councilwoman Black about possibly limiting ADU to one story in suburban context. But so Sean, can we hear from you? And there's a bunch of background noise, so it's a little hard to hear.
I just wanted to agree. Our housing situation is exactly how our ADU is going to be taller than our small little bungalow, but we're creating the housing for a parent and it is a 2-story because it's above the garage. So I agree that limiting it to say that the house needs to be larger, we would not have been in the position. So we wanted to preserve our home. So yeah.
Thank you. That's great. And Renee, is your hand up again, or that's from before? Okay, we'll lower it. So Josh and Abe, we have only 6 minutes left. I know you had 2 questions you wanted to ask and we wanted to do a wrap up and we have some other things to get to. So how would you like to, do you want to sort of fast forward at this point?
Yeah, let's get to the last 2 questions, which will be much less visual, not visual at all, actually. Just wanted to revisit the discussion about owner occupancy in accessory dwelling units. Sorry, this text is so small, but the scenario is that a long-term resident or homeowner, they are the homeowner, builds an ADU and rents it out for a few years. They eventually move across town. Under current rules in single unit zone districts, the ADU isn't allowed anymore when the owner doesn't live on site. So they either have to sell the property to somebody who will live there or decommission the accessory dwelling unit. So we talked about that a little bit at the previous meeting and now wanted to ask a few more kind of pointed questions about it. But considering that scenario, how do you think we should move forward with potential alternatives in this project? Should we assume that owner occupancy rule will stay? That the owner must remove the ADU if they're not living on the property? Or should we simply remove that requirement? Or should we make the owner occupancy requirement more flexible in some way because you're still, have concern about owners living off site, which might cause you to not want to just remove the requirement entirely?
And Abe, in the interest of time, maybe if people want to explain their answers, people can put that in the chat because we are really looking at those notes, and otherwise we'll move to the next question. Does that work?
Yeah, that'd be great. And so, it's a race between the second 2 options, but that together definitely gives us direction to propose something different. We'll have to figure out what. Okay, one more question about short-term rentals. So we have looked at ADUs or short-term rentals in accessory dwelling units and complaints received. So out of almost 1,400 complaints received since 2018, less than 10 of them have involved short-term rental of an ADU specifically, which is less than 1% of all the complaints. And most of the complaints, according to our colleagues at the licensing department, are that both the main home and the ADU were being rented, which is, it actually would technically be a code violation, or that the person who was complaining just thought that short-term rentals really shouldn't be happening in the neighborhood at all. It wasn't really about ADUs. So just wanted to give that as context for asking this question about moving forward, considering that information and your other thoughts. Should we assume that the short-term rental rules will stay as they are? Or do you think we should continue to discuss potential changes to what you can do with short-term rentals in ADUs? And it's true, there aren't that many ADUs, as Jennifer points out in the chat. Our licensing inspectors have said, though, that they really think that ADUs don't generate very many issues, partly because the properties that do generate the most issues are kind of the opposite of ADUs. They're really big houses that get rented out to folks who have big parties oftentimes. So yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
No, I'm because we have 2 minutes left. I wonder if people can take this, finish up taking the poll, making notes in the comment while we transition to what's next, because I know we're going to lose people right at 6:30.
Yeah, let's move on to what's next. And so I'll stop sharing the screen, and thanks for all the great feedback.
Well, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that in preparing for the June meeting and different tools and options, you're going to be looking at the discussion from today and the notes in the chat, and that anyone is welcome to share other thoughts with you, I assume, after today's meeting, if they think that there's important things that weren't voiced. But obviously, all of this is also in context of the earlier 2 meetings as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. It's just taking a quick glance back at our meeting schedule. So we are only at the 3rd committee meeting. We did release the public survey just this week, so hopefully you received an email about that. If not, it's available on the website, denvergov.org/text amendments on the ADUs page. And we're just kind of planning out some of our other public touch points. And so here's our updated sort of meeting calendar with some of our focus group discussion touch points as well. I can follow up with more information on those, but we will send out an email blast to give you sign-up sheets to join the focus groups. And we just want to use those as a way to get more input on some of these specific topics, things that need a little bit more attention, like potentially some of these suburban context issues, potentially short-term rentals, if we hear that that's a big concern. But we'll send out a couple of sign-up sheets. It'll just be a Google Doc that you can add your name to, and we'll see how many folks sign up based on the category of the issue. We might combine some of these issues depending on the attendance that we're looking to, but note that those are coming, and hopefully we can get signed up in the next 2 weeks to get those meetings started.
Great.
So yeah, just looking at our next meeting, we will have to push the next meeting to the 2nd week in June, just as a heads up. I hope everyone received the calendar holds that I sent out that should reflect that. So, but just note in your calendar that it won't be the 1st week in June, but it will be the second Thursday. And we'll start to look at some of those potential solutions. We're looking at evaluating some of the alternatives and possible outcomes. So we'll take all the feedback that we've heard from you guys today and really start to propose some real world solutions to to some of these things.
That's great. And I saw there was just another suggestion about a possible focus group and some notes on short-term rentals. But with that, we did promise to get to public comment. We have 2 people with hands up. I know a couple of you have to leave, but it'd be great if we could hear first from the 2 members of the public. So Narissa, do you want to go ahead and unmute folks?
Yes. Give me 1 second. I apologize. Taking some quick notes here. All right.
Thank you.
I'm gonna start with oh, why can't I see this? David Pardo.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead, David.
Hey, so just to give a tiny bit of background, I spent the last couple of years working for one developer in town, and I'm now working on a couple projects directly related to ADUs. But I just wanted to give the feedback that the 1.5 story, I know you hear it all the time, like is really getting in the way of being able to build these things. And I read somewhere from like a prior meeting that you guys can't take care of the issue of the porches, but that's something that people seem to really want. A lot of the owner prospective buyers of our ADU product are like, we'd love to have outdoor space that's attached to the dwelling unit on the second floor. And right now that's not an option. So people are like, can we do a workaround by having our external stair landing be oversized? But I just wanted to throw out those 2 things. That's really it.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate the comments. They will be duly noted. And Narissa, do you want me to unmute other folks? Or are you able to? I know you're taking notes.
It honestly might be easier if you do it.
Okay. Elise Maskell, you should be able to talk now. Go ahead.
Hello. I am in the
Oh,
just muted.
oh no. Oh
There she is.
no.
I think I'm back.
Yeah, you're
Elise,
back now.
I apologize. That was me. Go ahead.
That's all right. I am in the University Park neighborhood, and Councilmember Flynn, if he's still on, might remember me from just a week or 2 ago. We rezoned a property that we own over in the University neighborhood over by DU, which has an existing ADU that is not in operation because it wasn't previously zoned for such. But one of my focus is definitely the ownership piece. We have a long-term rental, and we are interested in that function of the ownership and the owner having to reside in the primary or in the ADU. Where could we rent the entire property when we are doing a long-term rental? Why is it that ADU couldn't be part of the rented space, especially for a long-term rental? I'm also in the same neighborhood as Rosemary. I look forward to meeting her soon, but I agree with her comments about the historic landmark. We're also in a unique situation where there is a property that's a landmark property in our neighborhood, which we looked at, and just the immense cost of owning and upkeeping a landmark property is definitely a labor of love. And those limitations, like the focus is to maintain the character of that primary building and the feel of the neighborhood. How can we better help those properties stay without being scraped, or even those that don't end up in specific landmark status, maintain the feel of the neighborhood, to allow for additional income for the folks who do live there or may do other things. But I think that's really important concept to look into as well. And then a slight comment on that height feel along the same lines as that historic piece is, what is important for the neighborhood. We're in a neighborhood where there's tons of these small homes just getting bulldozed and then giant homes going in. If the limitation of the ADU is going to be tied to the size of the primary home, then you could really end up with just more scrapes because people can't afford to stay there versus the property value that they have selling to a developer. Maybe there should be more emphasis on the design of the ADU to fit the neighborhood rather than saying it's a specific height requirement or size. And the comment of like relation to the size of the lot, I think is very important.
Oh, Ryan, you're muted.
Sorry, I was talking. Thank you, Elise. Really appreciate your comments. And we have one more. Stacy Schaefer, go ahead. Let me make sure you can talk. Okay, Stacy, you should be able to talk. Are you, Stacy, do you want to, if you can unmute yourself? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I don't know. Oh, my camera is not working. I was going to show you. I appreciate you talking about the perspective of what it looks like standing on the ground. I have an ADU proposed next door to me, and my house is actually a diagonal siding. And so I would love to invite anybody over to come on and see what the perspective might feel like. My entire front yard will be the side of this ADU. So it's definitely different for everybody. And so I just appreciate you talking about it and would offer that up. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. So thanks for the great comments, everybody. And there's just some final notes in the chat about field trips, about the Baker Home Tour on August 27th, focused on ADUs, and just props to the city for the great visuals tonight. And the presentation will be available online soon. Just like, do you know when, Josh, Abe, all past presentations are on the website?
Yeah, maybe mid next week.
Okay, perfect.
We'll try to do sooner, but yeah.
If you need it in the meantime, email the city staff. Thank you all so much. And we will see everyone in June. Any final comments, Josh, Abe, Libby?
No, thanks for the discussion. A lot of good thoughts once again.
Yeah, and we're glad you like the illustrations, got some good feedback on them, but yeah, next step is really starting to look at what if things were a little bit different about the rules and what that could produce. And so really looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bearing with us, staying a little late, and we will see everyone in June.
Yeah, thanks again.
Good night.
Good night.